The United Nations says aid agencies are not getting enough funding to tackle the worst global hunger crisis since the United Nations was founded in 1945. Adefemi Akinsanya now takes a look at the reasons why.
One person dies every 4 seconds of starvation. The UN says it needs nearly $5.5 billion to tackle the crisis, as aid agencies are fast running out of money.
Without collective and coordinated global efforts, people will simply starve to death.
20 million people urgently need food in Yemen, northeast Nigeria, Somalia and South Sudan, where conflict and drought have left many at risk. In South Sudan alone, 7.5 million people so far this year are in need. That's up 1.4 million from 2016.
The response is indeed scaling up. However, I ought to mention that the funding has so far not followed suit at a pace which is necessary. The overall requirement for South Sudan this year stands at $1.6 billion US dollars. As of now, we have received 9.3% of that amount, and more funding is urgently needed, not least to respond in these areas where famine is already a reality.
Aid agencies say the refugee crisis in Syria has drawn a lot of attention and funding, and there are signs of a donor fatigue. But some say it's more than just fatigue, that the humanitarian system is simply overloaded.
Make a wish.
Charities such as Save the Children are using hard-hitting commercials to boost lackluster donation figures from Western Europe.
Happy birthday to...
But for the countries the UN is most worried about, the donations aren't coming quick enough. Adefemi Akinsanya, TRT World.
Well, Debbie Hillier from Oxford, from Oxfam in the United Kingdom. She's the Senior Humanitarian Policy Advisor there. Debbie, thank you so much for joining us on Money Talks. This is first and foremost a humanitarian story, but we're trying to get to the money aspect here. Why hasn't the funding kept pace with the need?
Thanks for having me on. I think it's a really very good question. As your piece earlier showed, there is a very large amount of humanitarian need at the moment. Humanitarian needs have been increasing on trend sort of for around the last 10 years. And humanitarian aid funding has also increased, but unfortunately the gap between the two has been getting bigger. So while donors have been increasingly generous, there is still an increasing gap between what is needed and what is available.
Can you identify any areas in the world, any countries in the world that are not doing their bit, given their income?
I think it's a difficult one to answer. I think in terms of absolute aid, then the US is the biggest donor, but you would expect that as it's one of the biggest economies. So I think if we look at countries which are providing a lot of aid compared to their income, then it's a bit of a different story. So the biggest donors are the US,
yeah,
the
but
UK,
who's lagging
and
behind,
the EU.
Debbie? Who are the guilty parties here, if any? I mean, you don't have to name countries, but areas, regions.
I think all donors could do more. I think in this particular crisis, there is scope for some of the Middle Eastern countries to be stepping up. And obviously the US is in a difficult position with its new administration, so I think the US could definitely be funding more at the moment.
So well, you touched on the US. Has Donald Trump's new administration, which has pledged to cut foreign aid and put America first, have they set a bad tone internationally for foreign aid generally?
I think it would be too early to jump to that conclusion. I think there is a humanitarian imperative when we get to crises of this nature, and generally donors are extremely generous. So when we look at the 2011 famine in Somalia in 2011, once the famine was declared, then there was a lot of generosity from institutional donors, but also from the public. So I wouldn't lose heart that people are becoming ungenerous.
Let me ask you about the global economic slump of the past few years. Did you see a commensurate drop in aid, and given that the economy is expected, the global economy is expected to grow at 3.4% this year, why aren't you seeing a commensurate rise in aid?
There has been a lot of pressure on aid budgets. So obviously from the US, in the UK, there's also pressure, and certainly countries in Europe have been feeling a pressure on the general aid budget. But as I said earlier, from the humanitarian side, we're seeing that much less. When there is suffering in the world, then generally donors will respond. And if we look at that appeal for the 4 famine countries, at the moment, the Somalia appeal has had pledges of around half the amount required, and Nigeria has had pledges of around a third. But there's actually a big difference between money that is pledged in a big sort of conference,
yes,
and then that money actually reaching the ground. So there is one of the strong messages really is for donors to not only make a high-level political commitment, but also to make sure that money actually reaches the ground, because that's
yes,
where it can have the impact.
You're absolutely right. Debbie, will be keeping an eye on those pledges and seeing as they come in if they are kept. Thank you.